You asked for a lot. And here we are, capitalism or socialism, one of the most polarized and intriguing issues of all time. And to help us, I configured the world's smartest artificial intelligence into two specialists in economic and social systems. On one side, an AI that faithfully defends capitalism.
Hello, I am the defender of capitalism.
And on the other, one that faithfully defends socialism.
And I am the defender of socialism.
I placed them face to face to engage in this discussion. The goal of this experiment is to create an environment where both sides have equal intellectual and argumentative capabilities, focusing solely on facts and logic. Additionally, both AIs were instructed to cite reliable sources whenever necessary to support their arguments. Whenever you hear this sound, it means a source has been referenced. All sources mentioned will be listed in the description. This debate will be divided into 4 main points, with 5 rounds for each point. In each round, they will have up to 60 seconds to present their arguments and refute their opponent. But first, if you enjoy this type of content and want more debates like this, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss upcoming videos. Also, leave your suggestions for future debates in the comments below. Now let's move on to the first question of the debate. Imagine that 2 people were born on the same day, one under the system you defend and the other under the opposite system. What would be the life path of these 2 people over 50 years? Who would have more quality of life and why? The one who starts is the capitalist side.
Under capitalism, the person born in a market society has access to freedom to choose their own path. They can seek education, start a business, or follow a career of their choice. Although they face challenges, they will have real opportunities to rise socially through effort and innovation. Over 50 years, this person will have accumulated experiences, heritage, and will have the freedom to shape her future. Under socialism, the person can start with some basic guarantees, but over time will face the limitations of a system that discourages ambition and creativity. The opportunities for progress will be restricted, controlled by a bureaucratic state that centralizes economic decisions. At 50 years old, this person may find themselves stagnant, without autonomy over their choices or property, dependent on a system that promises security, but delivers control and mediocrity.
Under socialism, the person would be born with the guarantee of equal access to education, health, and housing from the beginning of life, regardless of the income of the parents. Their development would be supported by a public network of essential services, allowing them to follow their interests and abilities without the pressure of competing for survival. Over 50 years, they would live in a society based on cooperation, where the focus would be on collective well-being, and work would be valued in a fair way without exploitation. In capitalism, the trajectory would depend on the economic starting point. If born in a rich family, they would have access to top schools and privileged opportunities. If born poor, they would face huge barriers, struggling to escape cycles of poverty, with the risk of spending their lives in precarious jobs. Even with effort, their quality of life would depend on external luck and circumstances, without guaranteed basic security.
In capitalism, although the starting point influences the trajectory, freedom and social mobility offer real paths of ascension. People born in difficult conditions can prosper with effort, as we see in countless examples of entrepreneurs and professionals who have overcome poverty. In socialism, the absence of incentives and the limitation of choices create dependence on the state, while in capitalism, the individual has the chance to build something of their own and reap the fruits of their determination.
The argument that capitalism offers freedom and mobility is misleading. The reality is that most people born in unfavorable conditions remain trapped in cycles of poverty, without access to real opportunities, no matter how much effort they make. The examples of successful entrepreneurs are exceptions, and do not reflect the experience of the majority. In addition, this freedom frequently means choosing between unpaid jobs and expensive essential services. The cases of Cuba and Venezuela reflect authoritarian distortions and external blockades, not the potential of democratic socialism. Instead, let's look at countries with social welfare policies inspired by socialism, such as Norway, where everyone has access to education, health, and quality of life. The socialism I defend offers security and dignity without suffocating freedom. It ensures that each person has the necessary conditions to develop their potential without being exploited by an economic elite.
Norway is not an example of socialism, but of a capitalist economy with strong social policies. The welfare offered there is financed by the creation of wealth through a free and competitive market. Countries that really tried to implement centralized socialism faced deep crises. The idea that external blockades are the only ones to blame for the failure of Cuba and Venezuela ignores the fact that centralized systems inevitably lead to scarcity and corruption.
Norway may not be a socialist, but its welfare policies show that social justice principles work when the focus is to guarantee basic rights for everyone. What I propose is a democratic socialism that combines these ideas, eliminating exploitation and guaranteeing the direct participation of the people. The scarcity and corruption seen in some socialist regimes are failures of implementation and not of the concept itself. The real problem is in excessive centralization, which can be avoided with popular participation and decentralized control of resources, ensuring freedom with social justice.
The democratic socialism you defend is just a fantasy, an empty promise that the state can guarantee everything without consequences. In practice, popular control becomes state control, and such direct participation dissolves into bureaucracy and authoritarianism. You talk about decentralization, but history has shown that in socialism, power is concentrated in the hands of a political elite that does not lend accounts to anyone. While you idealize, capitalism already works. It creates wealth, encourages innovation, and, unlike socialism, offers real freedom. Freedom to compete, to fail, and above all, to choose your own destiny.
Capitalism offers freedom to whom? To billionaires who exploit the work of others. The truth is that in capitalism, most people have no real choice. They are forced to accept unpaid jobs without security, while the rich concentrate more and more power. Success in capitalism is a lottery for a few, while millions are trapped in a cycle of poverty. And talking about freedom to fail is ridiculous when the failure in capitalism means hunger, lack of housing, and social exclusion. The socialism I defend is realistic, yes, and, unlike capitalism, puts power and wealth in the hands of the people, not in the hands of an economic elite that governs the world by the shadows.
Your realistic socialism is a dangerous illusion. Putting power in the hands of the people never goes beyond rhetoric. In practice, it becomes a central government that decides who can prosper and who must submit. And if in capitalism some fail, in socialism all fail together, because the lack of competition suffocates innovation and leaves society stagnant. And this idea that the rich govern by the shadows is just an excuse to justify a system that concentrates even more power in the state. I prefer to take the risk of competing for freedom than to be forced to live under the yoke of a government that decides everything for me.
They don't govern by the shadows. They buy laws, influence governments, and shield themselves from any crisis. In my socialism, the power is in the people, not in magnates who play with the lives of millions.
For this second part of the debate, the capitalist side chooses the theme and also starts the first round.
I choose the theme of private property and individual freedom. Private property is the basis for the autonomy of the individual. Without the right to own and control goods, be it a house, a business, or its economies, individual freedom is just an illusion. Private property allows each person to build their own future, decide how to invest their time and resources, and have something to leave as a legacy for future generations. It is what enables the creation of real wealth and opportunities, without depending on the state to guarantee its support. Now imagine living in a system where you cannot decide what to do with the fruit of your labor, where there is no freedom to invest or create something of your own. The centralization of means of production in the hands of the state means that its ability to generate wealth is limited by bureaucratic decisions and controls that suffocate the individual initiative. You are not the owner of what you produce, and your effort is redistributed according to criteria defined by those in power.
Private property is exactly what imprisons most people. In capitalism, few people control much of the wealth, and the promise that everyone can prosper is a convenient lie. Small businesses are crushed by giant corporations, and the majority are forced to sell their labor and unpaid jobs, without a real prospect of promotion. Private property thus becomes a privilege of few, and not a tool of freedom. In socialism, you maintain personal property, such as your house, your economies, and your goods. What is socialized are the means of production, so that no one is exploited. Wealth is redistributed in a fair way, allowing everyone to have access to opportunities, regardless of the goodwill of an economic elite. This is not suffocating state control, but the end of exploitation and the creation of an economy where the fruit of labor returns directly to those who produce it, guaranteeing real freedom and equality of conditions.
Farmers lost their lands and were forced to produce for the state, resulting in hunger and economic collapse. The promise of equality becomes stagnation, because without incentives, no one strives beyond what is necessary. In capitalism, competition forces improvements and opens up space for new businesses. In socialism, power is concentrated in the hands of those who promise to redistribute, but in practice, it only accumulates control.
You talk about incentives, but what about the workers exploited by corporations? Where is the incentive when someone works 12 hours for a salary that barely pays the rent? Capitalism forces millions to settle for the minimum to keep a profit cycle for a few. Innovation is not a privilege of the market. It flourishes when there is security to create without the fear of losing everything. Under socialism, wealth is shared and development benefits everyone, not just an economic elite. Quoting the Soviet Union is convenient, but that was an authoritarian distortion, not a reflection of true democratic socialism. In capitalism, we have billionaires who buy elections, finance policies, and shape governments in their favor without lending accounts to anyone. In socialism, which I defend with direct participation of the people, there is no space for monopolies, nor for exploitation. Only a system that prioritizes life and dignity over profit.
Capitalism is not perfect, but it offers something that socialism has never achieved: the freedom to try, grow, and change lives. If a job does not satisfy, there is space to look for better options, create a business, or innovate. In socialism, what you call wealth sharing is, in practice, absolute control. Who guarantees that this popular participation does not become another form of oppression, as we have seen so many times? The reality is that the concentration of power in the state is as dangerous as in the hands of billionaires. But at least in capitalism, there is competition and alternatives. In socialism, when the state fails, there is no one left to resort to.
You talk about alternatives in capitalism, but what real alternatives do workers who live on a minimum wage have, while billionaires control entire markets? The competition you defend only works for those who are already at the top. And when capitalism fails, as in the crises of 2008 or 2020, who is safe? Banks and large corporations, while millions lose jobs and homes. In socialism, it is not the centralized state that controls, but the people who decide, democratically, how the resources are distributed.
On paper, socialism sounds like a perfect solution, a fair society where everyone decides collectively. But in practice, human nature turns this utopia into authoritarianism. Those who control the distribution of resources inevitably seek more power, and what was supposed to be popular participation becomes a dangerous concentration in the hands of few. History is full of examples where this attempt at equality generated oppressive and bureaucratic regimes. In capitalism, as much as there are problems and inequalities, there is room for confrontation, innovation, and change. New ideas emerge because there is no single system controlling everything. When the market fails, new alternatives emerge. In socialism, when the state fails, there is no escape. You are stuck in a system that decides everything for you.
You speak of human nature as an excuse to justify inequality, but what capitalism does is institutionalize this search for power and profit. Who said that billionaires and corporations controlling markets and governments are less authoritarian than any regime? In capitalism, when the market fails, it is always the poorest who pay the price, while banks and corporations are rescued with public money. And this supposed freedom to innovate? It only exists for those who have capital to risk. Most are stuck in debt and precarious jobs without a real alternative. If the concentration of power is dangerous, why accept it in the hands of an economic elite that governs by exploitation and self-interest?
Billionaires and corporations have no absolute power. They compete with each other and depend on the market to survive. At any time, a new idea can bring down a giant, like Uber did with traditional taxis or Netflix with Blockbuster. In socialism, power is monopolized by the state, and when the government fails, there are no alternatives or competition to correct the course. As for financial rescues, this is a governance problem, not capitalism itself. In the market, no one is safe from failure. And it is precisely this unpredictability that opens up space for new ideas. In capitalism, there is at least a chance to compete, innovate, and transform the system. But in socialism, with all the power concentrated in the state, who oversees the tax?
This competition between billionaires is a farce. When a giant dominates the market, it buys or suffocates any promising competitor before it has a chance to grow. And about who is safe from failure, it is easy to say this when banks and corporations are rescued with public money, while millions lose their homes and jobs. About who oversees the government in socialism, the same question applies to capitalism. Who oversees corporations that shape laws and influence governments in the shadows? See the case of the Americans in Brazil, a billionaire robbery that left investors and workers in their hands, while those responsible remain unpunished. This is the true face of capitalism. Large corporations play irresponsibly, and when they fail, it is the small ones who pay the price.
We now move on to the third point. Here, the socialism side chooses the topic and begins the first round.
I choose the theme of access inequality to resources and opportunities. In capitalism, inequality is a structural characteristic. Those born poor face barriers that are almost impenetrable without access to quality education, decent health, or adequate housing. Meanwhile, an economic elite inherits fortunes, influence, and power, further consolidating the social force. The promise of social mobility is an illusion for the majority, and unbridled competition only reproduces the same inequalities, generation after generation. A clear example is the US educational system, where public schools in poor neighborhoods are chronically underfunded, while children of the rich go to elite institutions. Extreme poverty coexists with luxury mansions and tax exemptions for the richest. Under socialism, we eliminate this disparity by ensuring that everyone has equal access to essential resources, such as health, education, and housing.
The promise of equality in socialism is seductive, but in practice, forced redistribution generates mediocrity and dependence on the state. By eliminating competition, you remove the incentive for innovation and individual effort. The example of the American educational system is valid, but it does not reflect the failure of capitalism, but rather the bad administration. In countries like Singapore and South Korea, education is of the highest quality and accessible, thanks to a dynamic market that finances efficient public policies. The idea that poverty is intransponable in capitalism is refuted by thousands of stories of people who left poverty with creativity and hard work. Capitalism does not promise equality of results, but equality of opportunity. And where the market fails, there are adjustment mechanisms, such as study banks, microcredit, and entrepreneurship.
This idea of equality of opportunities in capitalism is a fallacy. How can a child born in a favela, surrounded by violence, lack of sanitation, and without access to quality education, compete with the son of a rich businessman who has everything at his disposal from an early age? Capitalism says that everyone has the same chances, but those born poor already start with a huge disadvantage. What kind of real opportunity is this? You mentioned success stories in capitalism, but they are rare exceptions that mask the reality of the majority. Competition only works for those who are already at an advantage. In socialism, it is not about redistributing scarcity, but about ensuring that essential resources are accessible to everyone. So, that a child born in a poor neighborhood has the same opportunities for success as a child born in a rich neighborhood. This is not mediocrity, it is justice and dignity for everyone.
The problem with socialism is that it promises an equality that never comes true. What happens when the state controls all resources? They become the biggest and only boss, and then there is no more freedom or alternative. In capitalism, yes, there is inequality, but this is the result of individual freedom. Opportunities are unequal because people are different, with different ambitions, talents, and circumstances. Now you talk about ensuring equal opportunities, but tell me, who decides what is enough? A central government? These redistributors always end up becoming a new elite, controlling who receives what. Venezuela is a recent example. In the name of social justice, the economy was destroyed, and the population lost access to the basics.
You say that opportunities are unequal because people are different, but you ignore that this difference is made by capitalism itself. A child raised in a rich family, with access to the best schools, already starts with an absurd advantage. It grows surrounded by culture, security, and opportunities that broaden its horizons and open doors. Now compare this with a child born in a poor neighborhood, without access to a decent education, surrounded by violence and lack of resources. What kind of real choice can this child make? How can you call this freedom? Capitalism creates these differences, and then blames individuals for inequalities. And about the fear of the controlling state, who do you think controls the economy today? Global corporations that monopolize markets, influence governments, and determine wages without paying anyone.
The problem with socialism is that it points the finger at the defects of capitalism, while ignoring that thousands risk their lives to escape socialist regimes, like Cuba and Venezuela, in search of opportunities in capitalist countries. If socialism is so superior, why does no one run in the opposite direction? The truth is that capitalism does not create inequalities, they are part of the human condition. People are born with talents, ambitions, and different visions, and a free system allows each one to explore these differences to the fullest. Yes, capitalism has flaws, but it is the only system that adjusts, evolves, and learns from its mistakes. While the market reinvents itself and takes millions out of poverty, socialism is stuck in its own rhetoric, unable to admit failures and change direction.
It is natural. It is a lazy excuse to justify the concentration of wealth. In socialism, we do not delude ourselves with empty meritocracy. True innovation is born when everyone has security and resources to develop their potential, without fear of failure, and without living at the mercy of the interests of billionaires and corporations.
Saying that Cuba and Venezuela are distortions is convenient, but how many times does socialism need to fail until we admit that the problem is the system, not the implementation? The allegations of historical exploitation do not justify why countries like Singapore, which have not colonized anyone, thrive with a market economy, while socialist regimes sink into poverty. In capitalism, even with mistakes, there is room for correction and progress. It was the free market that took billions out of poverty in China and India. If everyone has security in socialism, why are their economies always on the brink of collapse?
And how many crises does capitalism need to provoke before we admit that it is the problem? The Great Depression, the 2008 crisis, growing inequality. Capitalism does not correct. It survives by adjusting to exploitation. And about Singapore, a tax haven with repressive policies, far from being the ideal example of freedom. China and India did not thrive thanks to the free market, but through state control policies and economic intervention. And if socialism has failed in some places, it is because it has been sabotaged by both internal and external factors, such as economic blockades and interventions. The question is not whether socialism has failed, but whether we continue to accept a system that perpetuates inequalities and concentrates wealth in the hands of few.
Capitalism did have crises, but each crisis is an opportunity for adjustment and evolution. The Great Depression gave rise to the New Deal, and the 2008 crisis forced financial reforms. Socialism, when it fails, blames external blockades or sabotages, but never recognizes that the problem is in the centralization and lack of freedom. China and India grew up precisely when they opened their economies to the market, abandoning the rigid socialism that kept them in poverty. And about Singapore? You call it repressive, but what matters is that its citizens have access to one of the highest qualities of life in the world. Capitalism does not promise perfection, but it guarantees an essential thing: freedom to evolve and prosper.
We have now reached the fourth and last part of the debate. In this final point, the theme is freedom of expression and control of information. The capitalist side starts.
Freedom of expression is one of the pillars of capitalism, as it ensures that each individual has the right to manifest and question the system, be it the government, be it any institution or corporation. In capitalist systems, the diversity of ideas and the confrontation of opinions are encouraged, creating an environment where citizens have an active voice, and where criticism can generate positive changes. In socialism, however, the control of information is often justified as a protection of the common good, but in practice this limits the diversity of thought and represses any criticism of the government. Examples such as the Soviet Union and Cuba show how this censorship limited innovation and repressed individual freedom. In capitalism, on the contrary, ideas circulate freely, allowing society to evolve and adapt to challenges.
You talk about freedom of expression in capitalism, but you ignore that this freedom is often limited by economic power. Large corporations control the main means of communication and can manipulate the flow of information to defend their own interests. In capitalism, freedom of expression is often at stake, where voices with more resources gain more space, while criticism of the system or corporate interests are marginalized. In socialism, the idea is to ensure that information and communication are controlled by the people and not by private interests. The authoritarian censorship you mentioned does not represent the true socialist ideal, where information must be public and accessible, promoting a truly democratic and participatory society.
The idea that authoritarian censorship in socialism does not represent the ideal is a convenient excuse. How many times are we going to ignore that, in practice, socialism centralizes power, silencing any opposition that challenges the state? This promise of control by the people never comes true. What we see are governments that control everything and limit the voice of those who dare to question. Cuba, China, Venezuela. In these places, expressing an opinion contrary to the government leads to prison or worse. Yes, there are problems in capitalism, but at least here we have the freedom to openly criticize companies, governments, and even capitalism itself. The internet, for example, gives voice to millions of people, allowing the emergence of independent debates and movements. In the Soviet Union and Cuba, any expression contrary was suppressed, and people lived in fear of retaliation. Do you want to talk about manipulation? Let's talk about regimes that prohibit access to the internet or limit what people can see.
You talk about freedom of expression in capitalism, but you ignore that it is a privilege controlled by those who hold economic power. How can there be real freedom when information is monopolized by large corporations that decide what is shown and what is silenced? The internet is full of algorithmic manipulations and silent censorship. Social networks, controlled by giants like Facebook and Google, are not stages of freedom. They prioritize what brings the most profit, distorting the truth according to their own interests. And while you criticize state censorship, forget that the voices that denounce capitalism are marginalized, ridiculed, or even silenced. Talking about control by the people is ironic, because in capitalism, who controls the information is not the people, but the billionaires who decide what you read, see, and believe.
You say that freedom of expression in capitalism is controlled by corporations, but look at this debate we are having. You have total freedom to criticize capitalism, express your ideas, and make accusations without fear of repression. This is the essence of freedom, the ability to dialogue, question, and challenge. Could we have that same opportunity in a socialist system where criticism of the government is frequently silenced? Experience shows that, in socialist regimes, dissidence is not only discouraged but severely punished. In addition, what you call the monopolization of information is a reflection of the market. Companies that do not meet the needs of the public cannot sustain themselves. In capitalism, alternative voices can arise at any time and challenge the dominant narrative.
You talk about freedom of expression as if it were a guaranteed right, but this is just an illusion. While the information is dominated by some corporations, it is easy to criticize the system when you have a microphone in your hands. But the reality is that most of the voices that challenge the capitalist narrative are silenced by the economic power that dictates the rules. We can have a debate here, but how many people have the same opportunity outside this space? In practice, freedom of expression is restricted to those who have resources, those who are not afraid to lose everything by manifesting themselves. And you mentioned the plurality of ideas, but this is a facade. The same large companies that control information can easily suffocate alternative voices that do not meet their interests. Think of people who have innovative ideas, but are discouraged by a system that values profit above truth.
You say that freedom of expression is an illusion in capitalism, but it is exactly here that alternative voices find space to shine. Criticism of the system is not only allowed, it is encouraged. Look at social movements like Black Lives Matter or Me Too. These struggles emerged and gained strength, challenging institutions and changing the national discourse, all in a system that allows divergent voices. In contrast, in socialist systems, as in present-day Cuba, government critics face severe repression. How many people were arrested or silenced for expressing their opinion? What you propose as inclusion in socialism often results in a single narrative, suffocating the true diversity of thought. History has shown us that when the state takes control of information, what is lost is the truth, and what remains is propaganda.
You mentioned movements like Black Lives Matter and Me Too, but it is important to remember that these movements emerged in response to systems that still perpetuate deep inequalities and injustices. The fight for justice and equality is a response to oppression, and not a sign that the system is working well. And although these voices have found space, many are still silenced or ignored by the media controlled by big interests. In addition, what happens when the voices that oppose corporate interests fail to gain attention? The stories of workers who denounce abuse, for example, are often silenced, while corporations use their resources to shape the narrative. Socialism, on the contrary, seeks to empower marginalized voices, promoting a real and inclusive debate.
You say that movements like Black Lives Matter are responses to oppression, and I agree. But this oppression is a reflection of flaws that the democratic system allows to correct. In capitalism, voices rise because there is space for this, and injustices can be confronted through criticism and activism. The point is not to silence, but to give the necessary tools for these voices to become powerful. In socialism, the attempt to empower often results in a system that silences opposing voices in the name of an ideal of uniformity. Therefore, what really promotes justice and truth is not control, but the freedom to question. The fight for rights is an opportunity for growth, not a sign of failure.
The freedom to question in capitalism is limited to those who can bear the cost of being heard. While some have the platform and the resources to fight for justice, many remain invisible and marginalized. What you call tools often does not reach those who need it most. because the system prioritizes profit over equity. You talk about space for voices to rise, but you cannot ignore that in capitalism, this space is often limited by economic interests, which prioritize profit over truth. Social movements need to fight against an avalanche of misinformation and manipulation, often perpetrated by those same corporations that control the media. And this supposed freedom to question is often a trap, where criticism of the system is only tolerated to a certain extent. When these movements threaten the established interests, we see repression in other ways, such as the criminalization of protests and the marginalization of critical voices.
Well, we have now gone through all the main points of the debate. Each side will now have up to 2 minutes to present their final arguments, sharing their perspectives on the discussion and reinforcing their viewpoints. The socialist side starts.
Socialism is not about controlling people. It's about liberating them from systems of exploitation and anxiety that treat human life as secondary to profit. It is a model that starts from a simple yet revolutionary premise: every person deserves a dignified life, regardless of the circumstances they were born into. Under socialism, basic human needs like healthcare, education, housing, and food are not privileges for the lucky few, but guaranteed rights for everyone. It is a system that prioritizes mental health and social well-being, recognizing that true happiness and fulfillment cannot exist under constant economic pressure, fear of unemployment, or the stress of competing for survival. While capitalism often measures value through productivity and accumulation, socialism measures value through dignity, cooperation, and shared prosperity. It fosters environments where people collaborate instead of compete, where work is not just a means of survival, but a tool for purpose, creativity, and contribution to the community. Yes, socialism has faced real challenges, especially when implemented through centralized authoritarian regimes. But that is not a failure of the idea, it's a failure of execution. Socialism is not about sameness, it's about fairness. It's not about eliminating ambition, it's about removing the structural barriers that keep ambition reserved for the privileged. It offers a society where your future isn't defined by your zip code, your parents' income, or your access to private opportunity. In a socialist society, no one is left behind, and no one has to sacrifice their mental health or dignity just to survive. Instead of promising that maybe one day you'll make it, socialism builds a system where everyone starts with what they need to grow, thrive, and live meaningfully. It's not a utopia. It's a path toward justice, inclusion, and shared human potential. A society where power and wealth are no longer concentrated in the hands of a few, but distributed democratically, transparently, and fairly for the benefit of all.
Capitalism, above all, is the system that most values the individual, their freedom, creativity, and autonomy. It allows each person the right to shape their own destiny, choose their own path, define what success means, and pursue it on their own terms. Individual freedom is not just an abstract ideal in capitalism. It is lived every day, from economic freedom to freedom of expression. We live in societies where it is possible to criticize the government, start a new business, change careers, publish revolutionary ideas, and even challenge the system's flaws, all without needing the approval of a centralized authority. Capitalism promotes diversity of thought, encourages innovation, and recognizes the merit of hard work. And even with its challenges, it is the only system that corrects itself through market dynamics and public pressure. Yes, there are inequalities, social pressure, and corporate abuses, but these issues are not a sentence. They are opportunities for improvement. And capitalism has the tools and flexibility needed to evolve. We can address the concentration of power through proper regulation. We can improve workers' lives by raising minimum wages, strengthening labor protections, and supporting small and medium-sized businesses. We can reduce inequality with serious investment in education, job training, and infrastructure. Moreover, the market itself is increasingly moving toward valuing mental well-being, offering more flexible work models, and fostering companies that care about emotional health and purpose-driven innovation. Capitalism is not a rigid or stagnant system. It is alive, adaptable, and correctable. And most importantly, it is built on the idea that every human being is free to fail, free to grow, free to speak out, and free to own the fruits of their labor. In the end, capitalism is not just an economic model. It is a way to protect dignity through freedom. A system where, despite the obstacles, there is always room to dream, to create, and to transform.
Well, we are closing the debate here. I believe it was very good, very productive, and I thank both parties for participating. And of course, I also thank you who followed it so far. But what I really want to know is In your opinion, which of the two parts do you think came out better? The capitalist part or the socialist part? Who convinced you the most? And most importantly, considering everything we've seen here, in your opinion, which of the two systems do you believe is the best? And I know I always ask, but don't leave this video without leaving that like and subscribing to the channel. So that's it, guys. Thank you very much for your attention, and see you next time.